Well, we're continuing on with our series. We've had a variety of church leaders and pastors and priests to come in and talk about, now that the election's over, how are they handling perhaps the anxiety and the stress in some of their congregations and parishes. And I am very excited to have with us today Father Michael Walker. He is the priest at the Shepherd of the Valley Catholic Church here in Southern Oregon. And Father, nice to have you in the studio. I've heard much about you. First time I got to meet you.
Oh, yeah, it was great meeting you too.
Yeah, and kind of home for you. You were born and raised in Grants Pass?
Well, born in California, but raised in Grants Pass.
Okay, and then went off to seminary and came back, and here you are.
Yeah, well, even went to college in Ashland.
Did you really?
Yeah, so that's where I finished up. So I kept trying to run away, but I keep getting brought back. So.
The call.
Mm-hmm.
The call. Well, thanks for coming in. You know, we have found ourselves very interested in the tenacity of the Catholic Church in so many ways, which is a very rich thing for me to personally experience or watch it happen on some of the issues that are close to all of us. But we come through this election. Wednesday morning after November 6th, my emails was full of people who, oh no, what are we going to do?
Right.
Obama's been reelected. He doesn't seem to be friendly to Christianity, to the faith, and he seems to be even sometimes somewhat hostile towards the Catholic Church and some of its policies. But before I get into any of that, have you noticed an anxiety level increase among your parishioners at all? Just these days in which we live?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it was even going on before the elections, because we live in a polarized political country. And a lot of people, of course, in the pews, I think they could be in any one particular camp, whether they're Republican or Democrat, but the way that gets lived out sometimes, it's like what you want is they go back to the core of the Christian values and morals, but what ends up happening sometimes is they default to their particular political party, and so it's just kind of a constant struggle in that.
Yeah. How do you encourage your congregants to just kind of, hey, relax, God's in control here?
Well, actually, it's interesting because after the elections, we're finishing up our cycle of readings where we're focusing on Christ the King, a lot of those scriptural passages that refer to the final victory, for example, and the idea of our hope being in our Lord and Savior, the ability to persevere in faith in spite of all and realize that God's with us through it all. So there are always going to be persecutions and hardships, but that doesn't take away from the providential guidance we all have from our God, so we just have to keep focused on that.
It appears that the result of this election is God's will. Do you believe that?
Well, God permits things to happen. I wouldn't necessarily say that.
Okay, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot. What I'm trying to is to figure out where your perspective is, because I had one gentleman on from Houston, Texas, and there were literally thousands, if not millions of people praying going into this election cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the core of that prayer was, Lord, your will be done.
Sure.
Now, maybe some would pray, well, let Romney win. I mean, I didn't go that far. My prayer was, God, your will be done. Now, there was an assumption on my part that there would be an administration change, but it didn't happen. So are you viewing this, do Catholics view this as God's will, or how do you see God managing this?
Well, I can't speak for the whole church about whether it was God's will or not, but I think what our role is just exactly what you said. We pray for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. We live according to that standard, and we lay it in God's hands. We do our part, but in the end, we also have free will. So there is kind of this constant tension that we have, because you can't always say that just because we prayed for something that God's will was done. But I do think God answers. I know God answers prayer. So it's just a matter of how He wants that to be, played out.
How do you view the future?
I've always been an optimist. I don't know if that's the Christian thing in me, but just ever since I was growing up. No matter what happens, I always think that God can use our current circumstances, to bring about His goodness and glory. I still feel that way. And I know that it's always hard, and when there's some sort of persecution or suffering, that people naturally will, question those sort of things, where is God in all this? But I've always taken the approach that, well, I think it's just kind of a healthier approach to say that, in the future, I look to God being more involved in.
There's a flip side of this, that when you come through, even a nation comes through a difficult time, and let's face it, I think the economy has squeezed us all. There's no question about that.
Sure.
That people have a tendency to turn to God, who otherwise wouldn't. Are you seeing that?
In some ways, yes. I know that was one of the warnings that Jesus gave his people in his day, is if we rely on materialistic ends, that it's going to be short-sighted and it might even get in the way. So if our faith and hope is in our God, and sometimes when we have things taken away from us, that can move us in that direction. So I've seen that in the lives of people throughout my ministry. I'm sure you've seen it as well.
Yeah.
People that have done missions in third world countries, they definitely see it.
Now, we talked a little bit before we went on the air that in a first world or world country like us in Europe, we perhaps don't see the growth like other countries are seeing.
Sure.
And yet, I don't know. I don't know if we can call ourselves a Christian nation anymore. It doesn't appear that we are. Apparently, we may be post-Christian. I don't know. We're very secular in a lot of things we do. But on the other hand, we still have the freedom to worship the way we want to, for the most part. So if there is an explosion out there, we don't see it like maybe a third world or a second world country would.
Sure. Like, for example, I'm the pastor at the parish I'm at, but the vicar, the associate, is from Nigeria. So in his experience of church, and he was contrasting a little bit about, how on fire the faith is in Nigeria and the struggles and the persecutions they have.
Right.
And looking at it from his ministry here, it's, of course, historically, the Europeans went down to evangelize many of the countries in Africa. So now the opposite's happening. We're getting missionaries from Africa coming in and teaching us what we need to know. So It's kind of interesting how the Lord works in those ways.
How do you, as a Catholic, view persecution? I mean, tough times. I mean, we haven't really suffered for our faith, but I think we're being squeezed now.
Right. No, I'd agree with that. I don't think that at this time we can put ourselves in the same camp as some of the historical sufferings the church has had, or even in other parts of the world where they continue to suffer. The Middle East. Terrible some of the things that are happening there. Certain areas of Africa and Asia. But it is true that the church in general is having a harder time because we just have to have the experience that, well, it's okay for everyone to be anti-Christian, and somehow we just have to be nice. And because of that, I think there's just an antagonism that happens in the media in general, sometimes politically, and so our response, we need to be above board, we need to be Christian in our response, of course, but it's just a little more subtle, I think, now.
Well, we're continuing on with our series of having various priests and pastors and faith leaders in to talk about what now? What do we do now that things didn't quite turn out the way we thought or perhaps even prayed for? And we're dealing with, as far as the election is concerned, now we're dealing with the reality is, did God permit this? Is this God's will? I mean, I guess those are questions that we really can't get our brain around, but the fact of the matter is, we didn't get a change. And we seem to have a very secular and polarized culture. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen so much division and polarization. Have you?
No, and actually, that was one thing that I mentioned earlier, is that our political climate has been so polarized that typically people are picking their camp, and then because of that, their politics are coming first rather than, their faith, and that's...
Yeah, and that really does bother me. I'm wondering at what point are we going to say, hey, wait a minute, we're falling into an incredible trap here. I am who I am and you are who you are, and because you're different than me, I can't fellowship with you, I can't love you, I can't associate with you. That seems to be so anti-biblical.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, and the idea, our identity is in our God who created us. It's not in our political party or our hobbies or anything like that.
Yeah.
We're children of God, and that's where our identity starts.
All right. The Catholic Church has been very strong in some of its doctrinal points, and they have been politicized in this country to become political hot buttons. Abortion, same-sex marriages, your stand on contraception, and now under this administration, as you know, Health and Human Services, wants to come after the church and regulate what it can do in some of its institutions like hospitals and schools and colleges. Have you felt the pressure as a priest to waver in any of that? I mean,
I think any Christian's probably felt the pressure to waver in that. The understanding of the gospel is pretty straightforward as far as I'm concerned, that we need to be especially uplifting to all life. And when we're talking about the most vulnerable in our society, then we kind of have a mandate from our God to be attentive to that. Then there always are going to be pressures, just as there always has been.
Well, you've had some very outspoken bishops and cardinals that have really taken a hard stand here and saying, look, we're willing to even close down some of our institutions. We will not have the government tell us what to do. I admire that kind of tenacity and stance and conviction, because if the government's nose gets under that tent to tell you what you can and can't do and what your belief system is, because it seems to be in contrast to the culture, then what good are you as a church?
Sure, and I've heard people mention, they say, well, we pay taxes, and for example, $500 million goes to Planned Parenthood. You know, so it's like none of us, I think, are really for that sort of thing, but we know that it's part of the tax structure. But the difference in this Health and Human Services mandate is that they want us to directly pay for services that are against our conscience. And it's not just the issue of contraception, but it's also the idea that abortions through contraception are often provided, as well as the idea that we as religious people are being encroached upon by a government that is not only being antagonistic toward us, but they're actually telling us what we can and can't do and what we have to pay for in our ministry.
So it's a freedom of faith issue, and I think what has happened,
I think that's the bigger issue.
Yeah, it's been politicized into being
exactly
a cultural issue. Now, on the other hand, I think the Catholic Church has perhaps been one of the great supporters of the fight against abortion, because you've put money into this thing. I mean, a lot of people just talk about it. The Catholic Church has put millions into this battle.
Well, and a lot of volunteers that are working tirelessly. And actually, it's obviously, it's not just Catholics. We've got a pretty broad base of Christians throughout the country that are really dedicated and supportive of, the right to life. So,
where do you see this same-sex marriage going in the Catholic Church?
Well, it can't go anywhere, really.
Good.
I did actually have this conversation. I was preaching about it, among other issues, with, the elections and things, and just kind of talking about, there are a lot of confusion out there. First of all, we all definitely are required to love all people regardless of their sexual orientation or, whatever they do. We all are called to love them and to foster them and lead them. But at the same time, we can't accommodate, the secular culture to the gospel norm. Jesus is very clear about the institution of marriage, and we don't have the liberty to change it.
Yeah.
So we can love and support people, but it doesn't mean we have to change an institution to do it. So
I just find it so interesting that we will go great lengths to go into prisons and minister to people who maybe even be on death row for incredible acts of crime, maybe even murder, and do what we can to save them and have them get into the kingdom of God and go to heaven.
Sure, we should.
But we'll reject the homosexual. We don't seem to have a plan to love them in spite of their orientation.
Oh yeah, exactly. Well, and I think it does a disservice to this idea that people think that somehow if I'm homosexual, I have no place to go to church. I mean, the church is open to all people. But at the same time, I don't think we diminish the message.
No.
Everyone has...
Because sooner or later it penetrates.
Sure, and people have a right, I think, to receive the full message of the gospel, and what they do with it is up to them. We have free will.
Do you get pressure to be anti-political?
Well, to a certain degree. I think you have to be a little careful, because I can't, for example, stand up at church and say, vote for this person or that person.
No, that's the law thing, and I get that. But on these issues that would be certainly foursquare with the doctrines of the church, do you preach and teach on them?
I do, but I always try to do it And sometimes there's spillover. People want to pretend there's a strict separation between all things political and all things that are about God, but our values and our morals are often played out in the political forum.
Yeah.
So therefore, we have an obligation as Christians to speak in the public forum with our values and our morals, because if we don't, who's going to do it?
Right.
It's going to be the secular world, and we don't think that's the way to go.
Now, I also know that the Catholic Church is very strong in teaching young people the ways of the faith and the doctrines of the faith. And to me, that's critical, because when they get up to these ages, when they're faced with these cultural challenges, if they're not planted and rooted, they can be easily swayed.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, I read a book that was written by an evangelical author, and it's called Sticky Faith. I don't know if you're familiar with
Yes.
that. Yeah, but it was very good. It talks about how we as people of faith need to work harder to make sure that we are actually connected in that relational God, and we're living it out in a way that it's not just obeying a bunch of laws or living a certain way externally, but it's internalizing and allowing that to take root. So, there are many ways that people describe that, but yeah, it's definitely true now. We can't rely on a Christian culture to bring the children up to follow the example of Christ. We have to be a little more proactive.
There's been great pressure on the church to capitulate on all of these issues. And it's been said, well, hey, why don't you believe in contraception when such a vast majority of Catholics are already using them? How do you respond to that when you're faced with that kind of a challenge and question?
Yeah, and sometimes too, it's a little difficult to talk about the entire scope of contraception and its relation, to human sexuality and marriage and all that. It takes a little more time than you can do in a minute or so.
Right.
But the bottom line here is its ultimate source is in the strengthening of marriage and marital love, and not withholding any aspect of that, whether that's our expression of love or the procreative aspect of it. And there are, of course, natural family planning and other means to assist us in that. And you also have the medical concerns that come around, that there's just kind of this unspoken bias, I guess, that you can never say that contraception has any bad medical effects when it actually does.
Yeah.
So, but I'm not saying we need to speak, of course, for everyone or the country. I'm just saying that these are issues that are a little more complicated, but they do go back to its root, to trying to preserve the marital institution. There
seems to be an attraction by young people to the Catholic Church. What is it?
Well, I could say the same thing about evangelical Christianity.
But I realize that. I think, but there is. I've been watching some of the numbers there, and as I told you earlier, there was a concern that when Pope John Paul died, that boy, he was such an icon for young people. That wouldn't carry over to Pope Benedict, and apparently it not only has carried over, but it seems to be even more attractive. And I'm wondering what young people are looking for when they're attracted to the Catholic Church, which seems to be so structured, which is a good thing, but it's more structured than you would see in some evangelical churches.
But I think what it comes down to is, there was another book that I read recently called Bad Religion, and it was talking about the long-standing historical interpretation of the gospel, and that being presented as kind of the Christian core. And churches that live by that standard, I think they do very well, because people see that it's consistent and it's not going to change on the whim of a pastor or the movement of the culture. So young people who are struggling in so many ways, they've got much more to face than I did or you did when we were younger.
Right.
So I think they like the idea of knowing that there is an answer, to their questions. There is something that they can hope for, and there is an objective truth that they can live by, and they can practically, do that.
Well, you're a delight to have in. Thank you for your time. I just also want to say to our viewers and listeners, the Shepherd of the Valley Catholic Church is about ready to break ground for a new facility. You're busting at the seams, to say the least.
Yeah, it's a wonderful thing, but it's a lot of work.
A lot of work. It's going to be a big project, but long overdue, I think, as we've watched that church go from a fruit stand.
Yeah, literally it was.
to what you guys are doing now. Well, Father, thanks for coming in, and best to you, and thanks for the work that you do.
And thanks so much for your invitation. It was a pleasure meeting you.
Okay.
God bless you all.